Yes, let's get started. This is Ryan Devens, a master's degree seeking student at Georgia Southern University who's going to present on his work creating a live pulsar generator plugin called Pulsar. It is a VST/AU/standalone device which has been used recently in the creation of a piece. And with that, I will turn it over to Ryan.
Hello, everybody. Can you all see my screen okay? I take that as yes. Can you hear this okay? Hopefully in stereo. Okay, cool. So this is Pulsar. I'll probably turn it up just a touch so I can hear a little bit better. It is a Pulsar synthesizer. I had to decide in part of the writing the essay is like Pulsar train synthesizer, Pulsar emitter, Pulsar. There's a bunch of terms that get thrown around. Pulsar synthesizer made the most sense to me. I had first heard about it in reading Microsound over the summer. Well, actually, I should say when we were talking about Contacta, although this being digital, it's a little different. When Stockhausen did Contacta, he had recorded them and then would play them back at different rates, which actually is not unsimilar from how I'm doing it, except I'm doing it with a wavetable. So instead of a recorded continuous waveform, I have a discrete sample-based waveform that I'm just reading through at different speeds, right? So the concept of a pulsar train is that of a pulse train. It just has a little variation. I have some diagrams for you in a second, but I just want to show you a little bit of pulsar before we get started. So I'm going to trigger it with the pedal. You can see no hands, right? And then I'll just play around with it for a minute or two. So as you can see, it gives you really precise control of the spectrum. If you might have been able to intuit that I'm controlling two formants and a fundamental, formant being a strong spectral energy in the spectrum of this fundamental frequency. All right, so let's get to some diagrams so I can really show you what's going on with a pulsar synth. I'm going to unmute that for now, or unarm that. And we will first go to some diagrams. Oh, here we go. Sorry, wrong folder. No. Made one just for today. Sorry. It's hiding behind my Zoom. Nope. Oh, guess it was diagram. Sorry. Oh, goodness. This takes longer than Ableton to start up. I thought I had open. Here we go. There we go. So this is from a Curtis Rhodes book here. Or I'm sorry, no, it was from an article. It was just referencing the Curtis Rhodes book. But this is a kind of a super collider type demonstration of a pulsar synthesizer. I think it might help. Can you all see this okay? Let me make it a little bigger. There we go. For me, instead of thinking of oscillator here, I would think of impulse train that's triggering these waveforms. You know, I apologize. I want to find, I had a list of ones that I was really, Just can't. I had them organized last night. They were sitting right here. I apologize. Let me just hop online here real quick and get them off Drive. Okay, here we go. Aha, here we go. I put it in the dock. That's why. All right. Let me zoom in for you. So what is Pulsar? It is a digital pulsar train generator. It emits pulsarets at a periodic rate. So if we think of a pulse train, it's that impulse that has an infinite spectrum, right? Well, instead of having an infinite spectrum or attempting to emulate an infinite spectrum, instead of that, what if it's the spectrum of a triangle wave or of a square wave or a sawtooth wave or whatever waveform you might use with serum or massive? That is a really fun thing to play with, to not have it limited to just that infinite bandwidth. And then you can start using all the things that you might use serum for, wavetable interpolation and switching between those waves. It can have cool transformations of sound. Each pulsaret has a waveform and a frequency. So not only does it have its own spectrum according to the waveform, it's played back at a frequency, right? This will become clear in this picture. There are three things to consider in a pulsar train. The duty cycle, which is D, just like a square wave or a pulse wave. And it is the amount of time that the pulsaret is running for, the length of the pulsaret, the period of the pulsaret. Silence, period of silence between pulsarets. And then period, the total length of the pulsar. So here is a picture of one period of a pulsar. All right, so for example, this is 50 milliseconds long. This particular pulsaret is a sync function, and it is 12.5 milliseconds long. And then this would be a sine, because it's getting up to a higher frequency, half of that length. All right, this is nice to look at. We have here following it a silent period. So this whole length from here, this would be the impulse, and then at the end of this diagram would be the next impulse. This is kind of a weird, clumsy pulsar train, though. It really wouldn't sound that good because this is only 2 octaves above it. I mean, I approximated the width, but it is 1/4 the wavelength, or 1/4 the period, so it is 4 times the frequency, so it is 2 octaves. That's not a big difference. I think it works out to be, 20 hertz and then 80 hertz, which is not very, that's really low. In fact, the range of pulsar, my synthesizer, can't even make a formant down to that frequency. All right, this would be more likely. And this is a combo of 10 hertz, 500 hertz, and 750 hertz. So what we would hear is at a 10 hertz rate, let me see if I can kind of emulate something like this. We would hear a ticking at 10 hertz, right? Oh, I need to arm it again. 1 second. Get rid of that verb. 10 hertz ticking. And you can hear those formant structures above it. Maybe not as noticeable. Sorry about the reverb. But maybe when I start to adjust them, you'll hear it. Okay, I just moved one up. Let's move one down. All right, so that's a basic example of being able to play with the formant frequencies with a constant fundamental frequency. All right, so this here is a picture of a standard pulsar train with nothing changing. In this example, there's only one pulsaret. It is this waveform. It looks like a sync function. And each of these lines is associated with a impulse. So from line to line is one pulsar period. You can see I showed here the pulsarette period is the length of the waveform. Pulsar period is the whole distance. And then right here is the silence that follows it. They're constant frequency. And as I change the frequency of the formant of the pulsarette, it would get shorter or longer. So changing the frequency has an interesting effect. Let me scroll down here, where like this is an example with an impulse train at a fixed fundamental frequency. The pulsar period always stays the same. But as the pulsarette gets lower in frequency, the width also gets longer. So the silence period gets shorter. They start to blend together. Pretty soon, they start to overlap. And some pulsar trains allow for that. And it just sounds like a continuous waveform. It starts to cause some phase wave shaping. Because if you start overlaying duplicate copies of the same wave, you'll start to get phase interactions. My particular synth does not. Once it gets to about this point, well, no, actually this point, it doesn't even let it get full continuous. 97%, let's say, it just caps it out. The other option would be if we had a variable fundamental. So let me get some good formants. I guess I have to click into Ableton to do it. So as you can see, I think that one's the most intuitive. You know, you're just changing the rate of impulses as they're emitted.
Can you reduce the fundamental spread so we can hear that again?
There shouldn't be any fundamental spread. I'm guessing there was a holdover trigger pattern. It's glitching out over Zoom. I can hear it because it's steady here in the tech lab. If people had come that said they were going to come, yeah, Zoom is missing it. It's a steady beat right now. That's too bad because, well, that's what you're hearing is intermittency, which is coming up to burst and stochastic masking, which we'll get to next. But is this making sense so far? The concept of a train. We have impulses. That should be familiar. And then we have pulsarettes. So we're not going to just play an infinitely short, as short as we can get, impulse response with that creates an infinite bandwidth. We're going to play a pulsarette over a period according to a frequency. We're going to have a spectrum according to the wave shape of that pulsarette. Is that much making sense so far? Because everything else kind of plays on top of that.
So is it always the case that the pulsarette is one cycle of the waveform?
That is an option that I can control here with width. It was getting too labely, so I just stopped labeling things. But as I change the width, it will start to do multiple cycles of the pulsarette. That does cause problems with overlap. And so I have trigger pattern. Here we go. Here's a picture of, oh, that's inappropriately labeled. Sorry, let me delete that. This would be width here. So first example would be width at about 40% with a very relatively high formant. Well, it figures out to be about 4 cycles. Well, in my system, it just, if you do half of a cycle of a wave, well, then you got to envelope it because otherwise it's just going to, imagine stopping at this peak of the sync function. It just doesn't, it's not very smooth. You should envelope everything anyways. I'll be getting to that in a second. But the coding of it was kind of weird. It was transforming the sound. So I set it that, like in this case right here, if I set width to be 60%, you can see it would only go partly through a pulsarette. And so I don't make that one. This would only be 3 cycles. But think about this now. If it's a really high frequency pulsarette, that's more cycles of it. And we start to perceive it as the more dominant frequency. It starts to sound like a continuous sound of its own. So pretty soon, if I do really high formants with a low fundamental, maybe 10 hertz, and then I'll crank that width up to about 50%. Let me kick it in now. Starts sounding kind of chimey, right? Kind of beepy. Now listen to it with low width. That's a really cool technique to use. I use that a lot, especially with the delay. Oh, I turned off the delay. That's why I'm like, what the hell? Where's my power? Okay, so yeah, that's important though. That is a decision I had to make. That I really wanted width, but I just it was going to be easier if I did full cycles. It just made more sense to me. And a big impetus for Pulsar to me is like I want something that's kind of hands-on and easy to use in a live performance, which literally means like reducing options, because so many. Although you could say you could set up workflows like that in more complicated synths too. So I'm going to jump back a little bit here. So we have the variable formants, variable fundamentals. You can jump in with questions if you ever have any. These are some envelopes. The envelope of each pulsarette is pretty important. So I think I showed well in this picture here. Each of these pulsarettes is being enveloped like that, right? That's a rough approximation. It depends on what kind of envelope you use, and that has a big effect. Here is some of the wave shaping transformations. You can see with the rectangular envelope, it really just means no envelope. I mean, it does exist, but it would be at 0 amplitude anyways. And these are coefficients. So like up here, the envelope is multiplying the amplitude by 1. Here, it's multiplying it by 0.5. Now, it's different than subtracting it by 0.5. I had kind of a mental breakdown about this because I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't add up. If this is supposed to be 0.5 and it's at 0.5 in the triangle wave, it needs to be reduced to 0.25. You know, it was a little bit more in-depth than I thought. But there was a photo from Dr. Rhodes that I was going to show you. Let me pull it up here. There's the masking. Oh, come on now. We'll keep moving. I'll find you the diagram here. I think it's down at the bottom. It just gives you different frequency spectrums to play with. And I think that's something to factor in. For mine, though, I just put it as Gaussian. I just made it this curve. It isolates the harmonic energy closer to the fundamental. It is good for, I don't want to say I'm using it as an anti-aliasing technique because I'm not. I'm doing something else to account for that. But it keeps it more centered close to the fundamental. Here. Right here. There it is. Okay, so here are 3 examples he gave. The rectangle wave is the biggest bandwidth, and it has these nulls at 1.5 times the fundamental rather than the integer multiples. And that's too small. I wanted that to be bigger. Come on now. There we go. The Expo-Deck, Exponential Decay, I have to switch between. I need a better picture. Here we go. Exponential Decay, curving down like this, has that really sharp 90-degree angle of the rectangle, but curves down and modifies, does a little bit of wave shaping. I think that it's important, like this kind of thing is nice to look at, but it really is not revealing of what a wave shape is going to sound like. In fact, I never trust waveform pictures to mean anything. I think it's just silly to draw a waveform. Like you have no idea what it's going to sound like. But something like this, FFT, I do know what it's going to sound like then. Expo-Deck is actually the one I'm going to implement next, just because it looks and functions very similar to a rectangle, but without those nulls. So it is just a wider bandwidth version of the Gaussian, to me at least, how I interpret it. The Gaussian does still have some nulls, though. So right now it is just Gaussian. It gives you, because I think, at least for this particular piece, I really wanted the precision control, and I'm thinking I don't want to blow any speakers up or anything. I thought that this looked less scary than this for high frequency content. That's probably a ridiculous thought, though. I don't think it would. You could mess it up either way, and I think is the next step I would take. Perhaps I'll get to in a second that one of the things I introduced is wavetable interpolation. Maybe envelope interpolation would be a good pursuit in the future. So right now I am only using Gaussian, so it is a very centered spectrum around the fundamental. I shouldn't say fundamental though, because it would be that of the formant actually, but of that of the waveform. Okay. So one of the coolest, oh, I'm seeing chats actually. And then they disappeared. Shoot. There we go. How is the waveform chosen? I have a yeah, it wasn't 10 hertz. I just threw a number up there. It was 10 hertz with a trigger pattern actually. No, 3 hertz. The waveform is selected right here with the wave slider. Sorry, my spread's cranked up all the way. It doesn't have a very clear display, but I am okay with that. What was going on, I think I showed Al and Andrew and them, I was having the waveform flash up in like a strobing style, because I really don't want any menus on this synth. I want it to just be touchable, right? But it was getting kind of seizure causing. It was getting a little intense, so I got rid of it, and I might bring it back. But right now it just goes from sine, triangle, sync, and then saw. And you can control it with this slider right here. So I could, let me kill some better settings. Oops. Now that's something I'm working on. There's a little dip in amplitude. So I think that is stemming from, this is something I was thinking about, where if I don't, I might have plotted one of them in reversed phase. I don't think I did, but I was hypothesizing about that. So this is a work in progress. I would ideally have one of the nuclear synth, which I wrote about in my essay, they make arguments for some other wave shapes, even to replace the sync function, which is supposed to be like the King of Kings and Lord of Lords when it comes to waveforms for impulse responses. So yeah, I want to get more. It would be cool to be able to bring in your own wave shape, but that is kind of, I really don't want menus on this. I want this to be a very clean synth. So, all right, the trigger patterns, as I call them, or burst masking, are on-off patterns, really. But think about that, because we're dealing with time scale so much in pulsar synthesis, it could either be a rhythmic thing, like in sense of like a form. So like 1, 2, 3, rest, rest, 1, 2, 3, rest, rest. It could kind of start to have a polyrhythm feel. And especially if you have other chains going. I guess that wouldn't matter, though. They don't necessarily have to be on a trigger pattern. But you can create really complex harmonic textures with things like this. Burst masking is the term used by Curtis Rhodes. I just think trigger pattern, as I'm coding it, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what it's doing. So an example of that would be a 3 to 2 pattern. So 3 on, 2 off. 3 on, 2 off, as you might guess. Let's do that one. Not just this. You should see it moving over there. The slider's being funky. There we go. So I hope you can see that 3 and 2 here. This is for trigger on and trigger off, and let's play it. Yeah, and I like these with some width. Sounds juicy. Right? And then you could do other patterns too. And, oh, let's take one up into the audio range. So let's do 4/3. Okay, and I'm just going to boost it up into the audio range. So it's kind of cool to it's like its own micro time structure because you're hearing it sounds like a larger pulsarette being the 4 on and then the 3 off is the new silent period, and then you slowly, as you lower the fundamental, you come back down into where it's like, oh, there's particles within those particles, and yeah, it can be a powerful tool. Sometimes I like to do this and crank the off up really high and the on pattern really low, and now I have like the whole fundamental is essentially 1/10. It's down by a factor of 10. So now it's like a high precision 0 to 50 hertz. So if you wanted to go high precision at low frequencies, that can be a useful tool. I mean, and then you start doing stuff like this where it's, oops, wrong thing. It reminds me of like folding cards, you know, shuffling cards like that. I think it could be a good tool. In addition to that, then there is stochastic masking, which is a intermittence in my mind. In my words, I should say. Intermittence is a term used by Curtis Rhodes as well, but he describes the word stochastic masking to represent a kind of like an analog misfiring. I don't think that was his intention of putting it in, but he says that it has results similar to that. I think it's another fun tool to play with. It's one that can make it go from a semi-musical sounding sound. It's like, oh, this is a pitch, to like, it's not a pitch. It sounds like noise. And that has different results at different frequencies. So we'll try it at a low frequency first. And we'll go to like 50%. You see this on the far right side. That's me adjusting the intermittence. The intermittence will happen on top of a trigger pattern. So right now there's a 50% chance approximately that any of these on hits will actually hit. It doesn't even calculate it. This is an automatic miss. So it works on top of the trigger pattern, not overriding. So let me get rid of the trigger pattern. All right, this is very low intermittence. I mean, yeah, you get the idea. But sometimes I think it's a little bit better at lower amounts. So this would be like 97% of the time it's going to hit. That can be a tool. I actually don't use intermittence that much, though. I think out of all of them, it so quickly makes it dissolve into noise, right? And similarly, it is effectively the same as having a variable fundamental frequency that changes stochastically. So, but intermittence was something I felt like I had to include. If I just put a little bit on, I think is when I usually like it, right? I'm going to, the rest of it is pretty intuitive. Obviously you know what pan is. You know what ADSR is. That's what this bottom part is. So attack, decay, sustain, release. That is relative to the whole train, though. That isn't for each pulsarette, right? So let me do a long release on a train. Let go of it. There you go. Obviously, we can now do a short release and turn it off right away. This is really important here, the glide time. So much of, like when I first started building this, I was really emulating Pulsar generator that Dr. Rhodes built like in 2001. A lot of envelopes, a lot of control from a mouse and keyboard, a lot of detailed parameters and trajectories, right? And it's ideal for that. And Pulsar is actually kind of weaker at such a thing. It obviously can latch onto automation, but there isn't an envelope system in it other than, you know, ADSR and then each envelopes. You can't like draw an envelope really, and you can't assign it. There's no mod matrix. Oh shoot, where was I going with that? What was I just talking about? Oh, so,
You were talking about Pulsar generator, and you were talking about the envelope that goes over the entire pulse train.
Yeah, I remember now what I was going to say. So part of what I wanted to be able to do, though, is to be able to affect these parameters stochastically. And then, so because really all of them need to be able to take some sort of stochasticism, some sort of randomization. But I wanted to, I don't know, make it, I'm afraid to use the word discrete, like covert, not so obvious. I don't want another menu because the first iteration of this was bigger than my Ableton window right now. And it was just too much. And I realized that I saw Emission Control 2, which just came out from Jack Kilgore, Rodney Duplessis, and Curtis Rhodes is advising them. It was way better than what I was going to do. I mean, it did exactly what I was talking about. So I'm like, well, let's change it up a little bit. And so instead, I focused on something I could perform with, something that has device state visibility, which kind of looks like this. So as I'm adjusting this, my goal is to make it apparent what parameters are affected and be able to look and predict what it's going to sound like at any moment. So this is the spread, right? Each parameter, I'll look at that question in a second, has a spread, which is the coloration here, the size of the coloration, and it will generate values that are within that spread as they're represented on the slider. And then there is the one I'm moving right now on the side and then on the bottom of pan is random. So the spread that I'm adjusting on pan is how big the range is from which the random parameter value will be selected from. And then random is the chance that it will happen. Questions? It's only Gaussian for now. I'm looking at Andrew's thing too. Yeah, I would add more. I'd be eager to. Like I said too, I was just thinking about that today. I could do envelope interpolation too. I mean, because we're talking about changing waveforms, and the goal is to get changing spectra that result from each waveform. Well, the envelopes change spectra too, so we might as well interpolate between those on each pulsarette. 2 randomized buttons. This is an idea, I'm guessing. One that randomizes the settings. One that continuously changes the parameters randomly. Yeah, that would be good. The parameters randomly one is I would just be like, well, they must have. I know there's a max for live LFO that you can latch to parameters. And my thought with this is like, I don't want to add another randomized button. I think would be cool, but or not even cool. Both of them would be cool, but it would be like smaller, like physically smaller on it. But who knows? I think I would do a studio version of this that is closer to the original Pulsar generator and is more mouse and keyboard oriented for automation. Okay, now I remember why I was thinking of envelopes. I had to add the glide time because in live performance, this is effectively my envelope for a train or for a parameter trajectory, rather. So like this is a long envelope. So if I change the formant, it's going to take a long time to get to the parameter change and to go through that parameter change, which is, to me, essentially an envelope. Obviously, it's not as hands-on, but in performance, I realized that this glide time really does take the role of an envelope. And then, obviously, the direction that it moves in is according to my gestures. But using the glide pattern, especially when it's pretty long, is a lot like a trajectory that you'd get from an envelope. So I've been thinking of ways to incorporate at least 2 or 3 different glide times, because right now it's global, and just for the frequencies. Yeah, so we have stochastic waveforms here now too. Obviously, we have stochastically generated formant frequencies and fundamental frequencies. And I've mapped these to my mod wheel. And now, when I play, well, here, I'll start with no randomization. When I play a note, it'll be nice and constant. Get rid of the intermittence. All right, now I'm going to take it down a little bit. Hear that long glide time. All right, now I'm going to increase the spread. They already have randomization factors. Right? This one sounds pretty cool if we go a little bit lower. And then get some width. Start getting chirps. Little intermittence. And maybe I don't want it to be such a big range, but I don't want it to, because I'm going to go faster, but I still don't want it to sound like a pitch. Oh, yeah, no release. Yeah, so the this was a big deal to me, and I think that's what, when I started doing this, I'm like, okay, this is a live performance synthesizer, and it is not so much a in the studio synthesizer. Now for diffraction, I did both. I used it both as like a fixed media recording thing that I used automation for, and then also a live performance, like touchable thing. Okay, if you haven't seen it before, if you haven't seen it from Serum, oh, that's right, there's a question. Let me look at that first. Yeah, I thought about that, Dr. Thompson, where you're saying, like, it kind of makes sense that, because when it's all the way up is when it's not happening at all. For me, it just made sense to, like, oh, we're going to push it down to make it disintegrate and, like, put it back together by pulling it up. But it could be either way. It is the only one like that, so that does stand out. I guess I would have to see what the users say.
It's just odd to say, I'm going to turn the intermittence all the way up, and that's going to give me none of it.
Yeah. Turbine spin up, spin down. What is that? Okay, so let me make sure I covered everything about the demonstrations of it. I think this would be good to understand, because everything else we calculate this way, if you can just picture this equation, everything else is playing with that. The distance between pulsarets has an effect. It has an effect on the continuity of the tone. It has an effect on the prevalence of, well, it has an effect obviously depending on the width, so how many cycles are in that pulsaret. It has effect, like, if it feels rhythmic, it can create nice, like, this is more onomatopoetic, but like nice tingly poppy sensations that kind of push away from sound as a wave and hypothesize of sound as a particle. So,
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, we have the period of the fundamental, which is defined as a unit of time, right? So rather than considering that there's 10 repetitions in a second, we say that each one lasts a tenth of a second. And if there's no intermittence or burst masking, then that holds true. And I'm wondering if you've noticed anything that would say at what point does the repetition disintegration of the fundamental frequency override our perception of the fundamental frequency based on the unit of time that defines the period of the fundamental frequency.
You're saying, like, how long the train has to last at all to even sound like a train?
I guess, because we're getting the fundamental frequency idea, seems like in two ways, as it's defined here. So we say the period equals the pulsaret plus silence. So that's the distance between repetitions of the fundamental frequency, basically. But at the same time, we're saying we may not play all of the repetitions of the fundamental frequency. So I'm just curious if there's been, in your usage of it, some perceptual observation that, oh, it seems like if I have the burst masking or the intermittence even at this level, we no longer perceive the fundamental frequency.
The intermittence is like right away, and the burst masking makes you think it's another frequency a lot of times, which makes sense. So, like, let's do well, here we'll do a normal one of 1 to 0. Come on. It's steady here. Sorry, it's okay. Now you won't be able to tell as well, but that's okay. We'll do 3 to 2. just had to go up higher. Let's compare it again. So at this point, it still, to me, sounds like the same pitch that's just being split up. Well, let's go even higher. And now it'll probably sound like a different pitch. Oh, it sounds way better here. It sounds so noisy in yours. Okay, well, it sounds like a pure pitch here, right, Alex? Yes, he agrees. So, shoot. But yeah, it is different, though, because in one sense, it sounds kind of like a tremolo or like that constant fundamental being split up. At other points, it sounds like a rhythmic pattern, and then at other points, it does start to sound like you're changing pitches, right? And you could kind of calculate, you know, if you went from 1 to 1 to 2 to 1, it would be an octave at an audio frequency. Let's actually do that. That should be easy. Yeah. I don't know what's going on with Zoom, but oh yeah, so that's a good one to play with. I actually don't do them. I honestly don't use Pulsar that much at audio frequencies. I maybe just go up and touch it and come back down. I haven't really. I think it would be cool to kind of have a theremin control, because I'm always controlling the fundamental with a slider. I've talked to many people about having multiple mod wheels to control this kind of thing, because right now this little slider doesn't give me a ton of control to be pitch accurate. But I think it would be cool to get to a point where I am kind of maintaining pitches with the fundamental. Or maybe not. That is, yeah, so that's how Pulsar works. I think it's a pretty straightforward plugin. I hope that people could figure it out. Now, this is the thing, though, is that I had to do some mapping to this. So it does have the sustain pedal is programmed to trigger the train. Also, just hitting a button on the key, any button does. It's not scaled for nuclear that I used. It is scaled based on the MIDI note you press. This is not. It just triggers whatever. It always follows the fundamental. Because to me, it is a noise machine. I don't really, and I want to escape the keyboard in some ways. But really, I need like a touchable surface that lets me have extremely smoothly changing values to accomplish what I would like to accomplish. So then it comes to why Pulsar, why diffraction? Why did I call it diffraction, and why, you know, what stuff didn't make it into the essay? Well, this is, Pulsar Synthesis to me is the audio version of free will, okay? We are affected by the cultural waves that move around us, and we are those independent particles, and we think we're particles. We think that we have our own independent trajectories, but these bigger currents of wave move through us, yet we can still change our lives. It's this nonsensical dichotomy of free will and complete influence over a human being. And so in studying Pulsar, or microsound, he begins talking about quantum physics, and it's immediately over my head. But I'd seen a long time ago a YouTube video about the double slit experiment, where it was observing, it was a reflection on a study where they would observe photons that they sent through one at a time through two slits, right? And if they're photons, if they're a particle, they should be lining up just through that slit, and we shouldn't be able to see anything else around it. But instead, even when they send them through one at a time, they diffract. It's like interaction that waves would have. So even particles, one at a time, still act like they're being bounced around and reflecting off of other particles in a wave, even if they're alone. Well, then we observe the particles going through one by one, and every time we observe them, they behave like particles again. But when they're not observed, they behave like waves. It's a really confusing thing that I don't think anyone could give an answer to. And reading microsound, it was cool because it was this thing that I like never quite understood, but I had heard many times on like podcasts and stuff. And now it's like, huh. So with sound, it's almost the inverse. It's like sound we default thinking of as a wave. We do Fourier analysis. It can only be sine waves that are infinite length that can only be canceled by other sine waves out of phase. And we're attempting to make a phonon, a discrete particle of sound, and whether or not such a thing can even exist, like logically. You know, I said to Andres the other day, the difference between a continuous value and a discrete value is the difference between a wave and a particle. So pulsar synthesis to me seemed so appropriate. Not on top of one, I realized I could do it. I made a wavetable synthesizer. I'm like, oh, let me just do this, but we only play one cycle. You know, it was easy to transition into. But symbolically, you know, even with my own intrusive thoughts, I wonder, do we have free will? And every time I observe myself, I come to the conclusion, well, the fact that I'm asking this question shows something that we have free will, but maybe just like that photon particle that when it's observed behaves as a particle, maybe that's me. Maybe every time I look at myself and wonder if I am an individual with my own trajectory, like these little pulsarettes have, I think that's me. But then again, maybe I am just part of the medium through which the energy moves through. So diffraction is an exploration of that on multiple levels, which also, doing things on multiple levels like that anyways is already so granular, so microsound, right? But now so it happens, there's a lot of parallels that this happens on. We have the continuous values of the analog synthesizers in contrast with not only digital synthesis, but the most discretized digital synthesis, pulsar synthesis. It is chopped up in individual waveforms that I'm controlling their emission. So there's a contrast right there. I could read into the symbology of Dr. Thompson's visuals as well, too. And we didn't even discuss it necessarily, and it just kind of worked out. You know, each of those individual points emanating from the same source but behaving independently, they come together and form patterns together. So not only is like the sample in some sense a sound particle, but also too, pulsar emits sound particles, probably more useful particles. Like a sample is not, you can't have a cycle of a waveform in that, and so at least musically, I wouldn't quite consider it a microsound particle, but it totally is in its own right. And so going through this spectrum of continuity and discretion, you know, infinitely nuanced values, and then like really defined values that we know it is at this certain point, has really been a theme for me these past 2 years. I think microsound has been a theme. I think that even that book that, if you guys remember, Hyperion, that I was obsessed with for a while, it was all about quantum physics too, and it was talking about this exact kind of thing. It just all seemed to tie together. So it really ends up being something very important to me, you know, to make, like, I love the sounds I can make with Pulsar. And moreover, too, like these micro sounds, I mean, I've been into ASMR for years. I've been a mesophone for years, where little sounds will drive me crazy. I can fall in love with tiny sounds. I can want to kill myself from tiny sounds. Like, tiny sounds is all it needs. The constant droning is actually really interesting to me, too. But I think Pulsar is a perfect summation of my time here in the past 2 years, like thinking of everything on that continuum of waveform to particle, of continuous to discrete, of free will or like greater influence outside of us. So I'd encourage you, I sent you Pulsar to explore that continuum yourselves. Does anyone have any questions? I would love to answer some questions. I did see some in chat. Could you control with the MIDI keyboard, send MIDI? Yeah, that's yeah, I mean, I could do that, Andrew. What it looked like, this one thing called Nuclear. It was like it was just like they were doing the frequencies but down like 4 octaves. Right, so it actually pertained to C, and it actually, like when we played C and G, it did a 3/2 pattern. It was polyphonic also, so it could have up to 20 trains going at once. It was really cool, but it was surprisingly not useful, because it's like, at least to me, because it was like, I don't know, it's just one of those things where it's just trying too hard to make it fit into the 12-note octave. And but it was really good. It was a well-designed synth, and their use of trigger patterns was better than mine. They had it where you could do on, off, on, off, on. You could like go back and forth. Yeah, MPE would be cool, or MIDI 2.0 that automatically latches, because this is basically unplayable if you don't latch it or do automation. You know, which also doing it with automation, for me, I would love to use something with just automation, but I think part of me wanted to make something that escaped the octave a little bit. I would like to have some control where I can pick an option to move in a certain period of time. Like I want 3 to 4 to go to 1 to yeah, that would be an envelope. That's cheating. We're not allowed to do that. No, what you could do is have a glide time, I would think. Maybe I'd have like glide regions or something, or like I have with because you could just have a glide time for those values and then change them over that period. Maybe more precision with the glide time. So put one of these on each of these parameters. That might be kind of cool, and you could more or less accomplish it that way. But it is touchable, so you know you got to land on 10 if you want it to go to 10. You know, and if you want to be precise, you should just program it then. Is my thought. But who knows, in the future as I make other synths, I'll probably change that.
Well, couldn't you basically do that in the DAW or through some other control program? You just,
yeah,
you know, you have some sort of clip that just does that one function over whatever amount of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
With automation.
You could use the modulation of an Ableton clip and just have it every time you play it to go through those things. But then at that point, it's like, well, you might as well just record it and bounce it out and then just keep it as an audio clip and perform with that, because rather than have it read through the automation in live performance. But yeah, I guess what you could do, another fun thing would be like to have these values modulating with an outside LFO, or on, should be kind of like an envelope, but just repeating. It's like every time you use it, it changes, like what Andrew was describing, where it constantly makes them move up and down.
Is that possible in Ableton Live?
Yeah, I can do it right now. I can do it multiple ways. But I'll do it with my Max for Live device here, LFO. What should I automate?
Fundamental frequency.
You want to do fundamental? Okay. Here we go. Let's turn that depth down. I'm gonna put it on format now.
Can you turn the glide time down?
Yeah. Good call. You can see it jumping. Ooh, that sounds cool. Oops, not that. I want to turn this down. Yeah. Now LFO the LFO, yes, we can do that. I mean, this isn't mine. This is the wonders of Ableton. You know, if you guys all love Max so much, since you hate Super Collider. Oops. This to this. It's a little. Yeah, so yes, I could map a lot of things. Now we're getting into the wonders of Ableton. But So that would be a fun way to use it if you like it. Obviously, I like doing it with a little bit of reverb that I also programmed on my own. Just kidding, with Dr. Thompson. That sounds good. This would be a, yeah. Anyways, I could screw around with this for days. There's a lot of things to do with it, and you all have a copy of it now, so you're welcome to use it. Yeah, so that's it. I could talk for days about this, and if you want to, if you have any questions, I'd love to. But that is the essentials of what Pulsar is. It is great with automation. It's great in live performance on top of something else. So in diffraction, when I perform this live, I also have a bass line going, and I would do some stuff with my right hand on something else. It was pretty easy for me to, because you trigger it with your foot, and then I would have like a 10-second glide time. Hang on, I have a hi. Well, I'm presenting my project right now for the group, so I can help you afterwards, though. Yep. It was a vocalist wanting some help. So shoot, what was I just talking about? Yeah, lots of uses. It's all golden. I think going forward, I would want to either, I would not give waveform drawing. That's just stupid. That's like pretending, right? And then also the other thing that's pretending is when you drop a clip into something, what is it actually doing? Think about that. When you drop a clip into a wavetable and it makes a wavetable vector of it, what is it doing? Is it taking that clip and just taking one wavelength of it, but it's not getting waves? It's like doing a harmonic analysis. You really have no idea what they're doing. So it's to the point, it's pointless to me.
Let me clarify what you're talking about. So you're talking about throwing in a long audio file as a waveform.
So like
right?
Serum will let you drop in a 2-minute audio clip, and it's like, oh, we'll make a wavetable vector out of it. Yeah, doing what though? Like with what harmonic? And I mean, at what point in the song? You know, what's the bin size? What's the window size? And how? Like, what is the trade-off between frequency and time? I just think it's silly. I think it's like a fun little toy that actually doesn't. Well, you know how opinionated I get. It's a fun little toy that actually has no bearing or control over what the resulting sound is. When did this type of synthesis become first implemented? Well, the first implementation, I guess I don't know. I think, the one I think of is Stockhausen, just using it artistically and experimenting with it as finite amounts of sound. But now I'm even questioning if Contacta was not the first one he did it with. And then who did it before him? He certainly didn't invent the thing. I think what he was known for, I'd have to check this again, was that he did like impulse trains with sine waves, like finite little sine waves. I'll look that up. Dr. Thompson, can you speak to this at all?
Well, I would say that if you look at Stockhausen and what he was doing before Contacta, he was doing sine wave studies. So that is sort of an extension of the Fourier idea. But then what led him to the impulse idea is the ideas of Dennis Gabor. And so Dennis Gabor has a different way of thinking about how sound is constructed. And again, we're back to sort of particle versus wave. And so I would argue that Dennis Gabor's ideas are the first implementation of it, but it's not a sonically audible thing. I'm not sure of what experiments he did that were sonically audible, but this is like 1930 something. So we're in a different realm there. There's been a lot of work done with other forms of this. So for instance, Fawf synthesis, which is a vocal synthesis, is sort of a variant of pulsar synthesis. So if we look at the work of Max Matthews and the Bell Labs crew in the 1950s, then we're going to see a lot of glottal pulses that are attempt to form different formants in order to mimic speech for telecommunication. So I guess my best guess, although I don't feel solid in stating it as a fact, is that the first implementations of this sort of pulsar idea are in Bell Labs in 1950s, 56, 57. But with pulsar synthesis as defined by Rhodes, Curtis Rhodes, as a specific variant of pulsar trains, then
And
that's
digital.
yeah, that's going to be 2001.
Yeah. I kind of consider Xenakis' work in this vein. It's not the same. Influential. Well, no, that's actually pointless because that would be like saying every wavetable synthesizer is a pulsar synthesizer as well. But it really is a wavetable synthesizer at it. I mean, for me, that's how I think of it. Are you familiar with wavetable synthesizer? We've built them before in Max and Super Collider. I think everyone's pretty clear on that. So, you have this buffer full of sample values that are amplitude values, and reading through those changes at according to the frequency you're trying to create, it's going to be like playing that wavelength at that frequency. Well, pulsar synthesis just only plays one cycle of that wavelength and then triggers another one at the fundamental frequency. Obviously, width can adjust the cycles. But wavetable synthesis can be a really good tool. Anyways, I started saying this because I was talking about Xenakis, and that's something I started reading. I got his book too late. I'd like interlibrary loan requested it, and then I couldn't get it, and then I got it from Dr. Thompson like 2 weeks before, so I was only able to take a couple sections that I was able to read through because it's dense, and dealing with the stochastically, not only talk about timescales, not only stochastically generated waveforms, but then equating that to forms of music, like musical forms, and generating that randomly, or having, I don't want to call it fractal because it's not the same composition, but like the same determinants at each level. And I mean, in every myriad of variations that can go along with it. My stochasticism is very caveman by comparison. It is generating a random value between a range, right? So Dr. Thompson and I talked about, what's a good level of stochasticism to add in. And right now, if I turn up the spread, okay, so that lets me have a random generation within a range. Okay, that's cool, but what if I could have it skew towards the outsides of the range, or at certain kind of do like a harmonic spread within the range? So like every other, it can only fall through on the even frequencies, or whatever type of determinants I could put in there. There's just so much. There's such an art to, I almost called it like generative stochasticism, or just stochasticism in general, by setting these like tastefully set skewed probabilities. I think is a whole field that I need to get into. And I mean, the equations he was throwing out, I was like, oh my God, it was tough. So, but I would be very interested in that, because even just seeing the effect or hearing the effect of putting an envelope on, let's say, or a slight change, because I'm dealing with it at such a very low level, it has cascading effects on the whole sound of the synthesizer.
I agree that having some sort of statistical model for doing this has precedent. So if we look back to the 1950s in the way that Stockhausen and the crew were doing serialism, that was criticized by Xenakis as basically being white noise because of the even distribution of randomness with a 12-tone or a serialized method of composing. So Xenakis' idea was then to have tendencies in the randomness. So still random, but tending toward. And I think that musically resonates and would be useful in this application.
Yeah, the question is just like concise. I want it to look very clean and no menu style. But so I think I pitched this in my essay is like, and Dr. Thompson countered it obviously, but like I said, like, in granular microsound pulsar synthesis, in that vein, we've had a whole lot of Don Buklas on the West Coast making experimental, out there, genius stuff, right? But that, people aren't going to go buy very likely. And then what we need is the East Coast Robert Moog, and that's what I'm going to be. And this is definitely more of a Moog than Pulsar Generator was. It's definitely limited, but that's not necessarily bad, and sometimes that facilitates even greater creativity. Dr. Thompson countered saying that Barry Truow kind of found an aesthetically pleasing application of Pulsar synthesis, but I don't see any of his software, so we'll wait and see.
It's
I
called
know.
Pod. It was called
Yeah.
Pod. It was available in the 90s, for instance, early 2000.
There's
But
a
I think you could make a justification for the interface you've chosen based on Lori Spiegel, for instance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who says she says that everything has to be at the fingertips. It's not good enough for it to be non-real time, basically.
Mm-hmm. And that is a benefit of pulsar generation too. I mean, because so like the difference between granular synthesis and pulsar synthesis is you're getting a wave shape from a wavetable in pulsar synthesis. In granular synthesis, it's like a randomly enveloped section of a clip, a grain, which is essentially a wave shape. So I make the argument that they're more tied than it seems. I think sometimes they're kind of separated because it's like, oh, with pulsar synthesis, well, you're using a wavetable and it's generated, and with granular synthesis, you're getting it from a clip, right? Well, we're enveloping all of them, and if to me a 2-minute clip that you're taking grains from is essentially a 2-minute wavetable, especially if things like Serum let you drag and drop them in. And although, again, I would say that granulating it is better than dragging and dropping, like Serum or Massive let you do. And so I really thought about that.
I wouldn't convolve those two. I mean, so granular synthesis is going to choose grains from a larger file. It's not trying to condense that large file into a single waveform. And I would argue that pulsar synthesis is a variant of granular synthesis being a large umbrella.
Yeah, well, I just say something that's selecting from a clip and taking grains, I think is more similar to pulsar synthesis than I previously thought. Because what is a wavetable vector but a small clip of grains, of waveforms? And what is a clip that we're going to granulate other than a very large wavetable vector that I can interpolate between? It's an extremely large wavetable vector. But to me, it is pretty much the same. The only way it could compete, though, is if we actually did like an analysis and found clips of like different spectrums, and then I could consciously choose the spectrum as I interpolate between it. Whereas now with granular synthesis, if it's not organizing that, you're just going through randomly. You don't know what the spectrum is going to be, but it still is essentially a wavetable vector, just of a ton of waveforms.
I think perceptually it's different. When we hear granular, so taking from sampled sound, right? So if the source that we're granulating is musique concrète, then perceptually we hear sounds or bits of sounds that we're somewhat familiar with if we make the time scale high enough. Whereas with something like pulsar synthesis, then we do not recognize the sound. It is not one that is a recorded sound. Now, what Curtis Rhodes does that's different than Horatio Vagione is that he actually granulates his recordings of pulsars. And so his sounds are not ever the sounds, more recently, are not ever the sounds of pre-recorded things that are not synthesized. Whereas Vagione is going to always choose to granulate recorded sounds for the most part that are real natural sounds.
Yeah, I think I'm looking at it from programming, and it's like it doesn't matter to me if I'm randomly selecting a waveform. I don't care what sort of vector it's from. I can randomly select it based on this range. You just tell me how big of a range to randomly select from.
Can you make it sound like a cat?
If I made that cat into a wavetable.
Right, well then that would be granular synthesis.
Well, that's a semantic disagreement because I think they're. Well, yeah, I guess it would be. I just would think that it's very similar. Pulsar synthesis to me seems. I just mistakenly, and I mean this is me saying from my perspective, I had them separated, and to me, I think they're extremely similar. I guess the big difference you're describing, though, the only way you'd start to identify things is if the grain's long enough, right? Well, but you can start identifying the pulsarette as its own frequency if the width is long enough, which is also like making the grain long enough.
Well, defining its frequency is different than defining its source. So am I going to know it's a square wave? Maybe. But also, it's interesting that it's named granular synthesis, right? Because synthesis implies something, whereas sound granulation is something else. So it's a little bit of confused terminology, I think, from historically. Granular synthesis implying that we're generating something in a synthetic way, whereas in the end, it's actually taking recorded sound in many cases if we're talking about sound granulation.
Yeah. Yeah, so with this, I just want to, I don't know. I don't know if I sell this, if this will be a big cash cow. I think it looks really cool, though. And I think diffraction had a good result. To me, I think it is in some way, I'm going to push it as an ASMR machine because, that's just the TikTok world we live in. And I like that stuff, too. But I think it could be useful in sound design as well. I really want to play jazz with this. I want to do some out there jazz and solo with this thing. And why not? Like, people, if you have a good sound system, people love nice sounds. So I'd try it. I think it helps. It actually works pretty well to like play over a backing track type situation too. It doesn't sound out of place. So you do need a good sound system to really appreciate it, though.
All right. Well, I guess I know that today I saw that Diffraction, the piece of music made with Pulsar and a couple analog devices, has been re-released in a new format. So you have two options, I suppose. You can view the option where we recorded live with cameras, or you can view the option where we recorded live and you can just see the light ballet with the sound.
Yeah, I recommend you watch it before they run out. I'm going to do that blockchain thing on these, so there's going to be a limited number of digital copies of these.
Oh, that'd be amazing.
Definitely. Yeah, please watch and like and subscribe and share that thing around. I'm really pushing it right now.
As an older user, I found that it was most useful to go to your site and then click on the playlists and find the appropriate playlist for this, right? And that way, all 4 movements are in the same place. For everybody under 40, that's not news to you, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, that's how I always do it. But yeah, so it's I'm really happy with it. Thanks, Al, for filming, and Dr. Thompson for doing these visuals. It looks sweet. It looks very different with the black background. I like it though a lot.
I found the resolution, at least on the last one, to be a little circumspect. It's supposed to be 1080, and that's what it was recorded at. But whatever's happening in YouTube or whatever makes it not look so high res.
Yeah, it was weird. It just didn't. I didn't even when I just watched it out of the. Well, yeah, we'll talk about it later. I don't think it was. I think when I got it or when I opened it or something, maybe with QuickTime, it wasn't playing it at the res I wanted it to, and then when I edited it, it was just like it was already done. But
I feel like those cameras struggle with like low light.
no, he's talking about the all visual one that he just.
Okay. Sorry, my bad.
So yeah. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so it's I'd love if you watched it. Thinking about the next thing, I'm gonna probably do a version with commentary and then maybe explain a little bit about Pulsar, really milk it, and get on to the next thing.
Well, we'll have one more round of questions, maybe, if there's a question or two, or if there's no questions, that's okay too.
Dr. Harwood, do you have questions?
I want to get back to the particle versus wave thing and the free will idea.
Yeah.
So it occurred to me that if you consider yourself the observer, and that as you observe your own free will, that perhaps what happens is you collapse the wave function and then you determine it for yourself as the observer. Whereas something less self-aware, maybe, like an animal, goes through its life without ever worrying about that question, and so the wave function is never collapsed, and it ends up however it ends. And by observing yourself, you are going to basically make by just that act you have already
You are
determined
making yourself have free will. Yeah.
yeah.
That is interesting. Yeah, that's it. And that's so it's like, and then diffraction becomes like an execution of that will. Like, no, this is me saying I have free will. I can control my mind, you know. Yeah, it's, yeah. Deep.
Well, with that, I guess we ought to end. I'm going to stop.